All right, so how did that go? Now, I want you to really give this a good go before you come and check the solutions, because this really is how you're going to prove to yourself that you've actually internalized and learned all of this information that we've been teaching you. But once you have done, and if you want to check the solution, or you just want to fix a particular bug or see how I did it, then go ahead and continue watching. So when we first start off, this is the website that we've got. And notice that it's already been styled and it's already set up so that we can start writing JavaScript. Now there's just one problem. We currently don't have a JavaScript file. So we're going to go into our project and we're going to create a new file that's called index.js. So now that we have our JavaScript file, it's still not linked to our index.html. Just as we linked up our style sheet in the CSS sections, we have to link up our index.js. And the best place to do that is just before the end of the body. So we're going to create a script tag that has an external source, and the source is going to be index.js. So now we can test this by simply writing an alert that says working. And now if we reload our website and we get our alert, then we know that our JavaScript has been linked up without any issues. All right, so that's step one. Now, the next thing we want to do is to place some images into our image elements by default. So when our website starts up, it should have two images of the Dicee face already showing. So we know that our images are located in a folder called images, and they're numbered Dice 1 through to Dice 6. So we can simply change the source here to images/dice6.png. And we can do the same thing over here. And now if we hit save and refresh, we've got some dice on the page. Looking pretty good. All right, so that's step 2. Now, step 3 involves going into our index.js and generating some random numbers that we're going to be using to select a random dice face. So we first have to create a variable called random number 1. And remember that to create a random number, we simply use the method math.random. And this will generate a number between 0 and 0.9999999 recurring. So in our case, we need a random number between 1 and 6. So we'll need to multiply this random number that we get by 6. So if the random number was between 0 and 0.9, then we now have a number between 0 and 5. And we can't have that random number be a decimal number. So we need it to be a whole number. And we can do that by rounding it down using math.floor. So remember that if at any point you're not quite sure what your code is doing, you can always just copy it and paste it into your console and just run it to see what the values are. So we're currently getting random numbers between 0 and 5. So to change that range from 0 to 5 to 1 to 6, all we need to do is just to add 1. So let's recap on this method. We're generating a random number between 0 and 0.99999. Then we're multiplying that number, whatever it may be, by 6 in order to change it to between 0 and 5.99999. Then we're rounding that number down to the nearest whole number, so it becomes between 0 and 5. And finally, we're changing that range from between 0 and 5 to between 1 and 6 by simply adding 1 to the number. And you can verify each step of this code by simply testing it out inside the console. Now, if any of this seemed confusing, then make sure that you go back to our lesson on randomization, where we talked about this in more detail. All right, so now we have a random number 1, which is going to give us a random number between 1 and 6. And then we're going to use this random number to select a random dice image. So you might notice that our dice images are very handily named from dice 1 through to dice 6. So we can simply use concatenation to add this number to the end of the string dice and get our random dice image. So let's create a variable called random dice image, and we can create this using concatenation. So we can say dice plus random number 1 plus .png. So this will be a string that is from dice1.png through to dice6.png. So we can now use that string to change the source of our image to that random image name. So the next part is changing that attribute value for the source. So at the moment, it's just a static image. It's always going to show dice6. But we're going to change this string based on the random number that we got back. So in order to change it, we have to tap into the source attribute of our image element. So notice that the source is actually not just the name of the image, but it also has the folder that the images are contained in. And that's because all of our dice images are nested inside this folder called images, which is how we would normally organize our assets. So in order to include that name, we also have to add it by concatenation. So we can say var image random image source equals images, which is the name of the folder. Notice that it's a plural with an S, and then / plus random dice image. Now this step is optional because you can also add it in here, but I think it's just easier for you to see what's going on, so I'm leaving it as a separate line here. So now what we'll get back inside this variable will be something like images / dice1.png through to images / dice6.png. So now we're ready to change the source attribute of our image element. So do you remember how you can change the attributes of the elements? Well, before we do anything, we have to first select the element. So we'll say document.query selector all, because we actually have two images that we need to change rather than just selecting the first one. So we're going to use query selector all, and we're going to select based on our image tag. So we're going to get two of these back. And to tap into the first one, we just have to specify the index 0 inside a square bracket. So now we can either assign this to a variable, say var image1 equals this document, a query selector image at index 0, or you can simply just continue along that same line. But let's make it easier to see by separating it all out. So now we've got image 1, and we can now set its attribute by using the method setAttribute. Now, in this case, the first input in here has to be the attribute's name that you want to change. And in our case, the one that we want to change is the attribute called source. So let's put that in there. And the second parameter, or the second input, is what we want to change it to. So we want to change it to our random image source. So we'll just put that variable in there, random image source. So now if we hit save and we go back to our website and we refresh it, then you can see that every time that we refresh the website, we get a new random dice showing up on the left. And it's going between dice1.png through to dice6.png. All right, so now we have to do exactly the same thing for the second image element. Now, very often, you will be tempted to copy and paste code. And I just want you to hear my voice in your head whenever you do that, to remember that it's probably better to just write out the code for extra coding practice. Because when you copy and paste code, especially in a case like this, I will bet that you will probably get at least 1 or 2 bugs. So let's just write out our code instead. Now, the first thing we need to create is a random number 2. And this is going to equal exactly the same thing, math.floor, math.random, multiply that by 6, and then add 1 to the value. So now we can use random number 2 to create the second random dice image. So in this case, I'm going to make it a little bit simpler, and we can cut down on these 2 lines of code. So we can simply say var random image source2 equals images/dice plus random number 2 plus .png. So now we have our random image source 2. Then we can go ahead and perform the next 2 steps, which I'll combine into one line as well. So you can see how you can do it. So we're going to use document.querySelectorAll, and we're going to select our image element, and we're going to grab the second one in the array. So we're going to tap into the one at indexed 1. Now that we've gotten this element using these lines of code, we're going to set its attribute. And the attribute we're going to set is source, and the value we're going to set it to is random image source 2. So now if we hit save and we refresh, then you can see that both our dices are generating new random dice images. It's pretty neat, right? Now the next step we have to address is the title. And we're going to change the inner HTML of the title depending on what was the result of the dice roll. So we can use an if statement to do this. We can say that if random number 1 was greater than random number 2, then in that case, that means player 1 won. So we're going to tap into the H1 by saying document.querySelector, because in this case, we only have one H1. And we're going to say dot inner HTML equals, you can put whatever you want here, but I'm just going to say player 1 wins. And I'm going to add a little emoji tag in here. So on a Mac, if you wanted to add emojis, then you can simply go into edit, emoji and symbols. And on a Windows, you can simply search for the flag emoji inside Google Chrome. So this is the case where if player 1 wins. So the next one is going to be an else if. And in this case, this is what if random number 2 was greater than random number 1? Then clearly that means that player 2 won. So we'll say document.querySelector h1.innerHTML equals player 2 wins. Now finally, the third scenario is what if random number 1 actually equaled random number 2? Well, in that case, we'll address it with an else statement. And we'll say document.querySelector h1.innerHTML equals draw. Cool. So now if we hit save and we refresh our page, then you can see that depending on the dice roll, then we'll tell the user which player won, or whether if there was a draw. So I hope you had fun with this challenge and it helped you to get to grips with a lot of the things that we've been learning in these past few lessons. Now, of course, depending on how you wrote your code, it could have been a lot shorter or a lot longer, or you might have used different ways, like say, get element by ID or get element by tag name instead of query selector or query selector or. And of course, if you wanted to refactor your code and make it a lot shorter, then you can always do that. But always remember that there is a healthy balance between really short code and expressive code that anybody could understand when they came around. So I would say something like this is probably a little bit too long, but I think it helps to see what's going on exactly every step of the way. Now, if you were to go even more extreme and to say, instead move this into here and then move this into here. Now this code will still work, but having such a long line of code where everything is happening all in one place is a little bit much, and it makes it harder for anybody else who comes along to understand what's going on in your code. So I recommend aiming for that healthy balance and aiming to keep your code really, really readable. Now, in the next module, we're going to be digging into some more intermediate parts of the document object model, and we're going to see how we can respond to events such as button clicks and also keyboard strokes. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.